protocols. I love protocols that are essentially like, don't move in with, marry, or get engaged to, or have a child with somebody in the first year. This cuts in both directions. Just don't make that agreement in year one. As well as for any behavior that kind of cues those senses, gets your spidey senses up, like, ask yourself, would 90% or more of people do that behavior? And if it's a no, like, you have to pause. In other words, what he's saying in this book is that most people are actually pretty healthy, but that most of the woes of the world are created by about 10% of people, which he calls these high conflict people. But they don't always come out high conflict like screaming and yelling. They're often very tactical and manipulative and very vindictive. They'll leverage victimhood, they'll leverage a lot of different things. And again, cuts across men and women equally, he claims. And again, I don't know the data behind this book, but the book itself just feels like a very useful thing that everybody should know about. So I'm enjoying reading this book, going, oh my God, I wish I had this book years ago. Plus, I'm realizing, like, oh yeah, like, we always hear this, like, most of our problems come from a very small set of people and things.
And most of society's problems.
And so who are these people? So we tend to call them narcissists or sociopaths or psycho, but those labels, while very useful in the clinic, I think have been overused in the general public. And like, we're not clinicians. We're not diagnosing anybody. And so, but difficult people that can ruin your life abound. But it turns out it's only about 10%. So, and it has some very specific protocols of how to deal with the people who are more outwardly aggressive versus play victim, etc. Very useful book. I think
it sucks that you have to think that way, though. Can you just enjoy someone? Enjoy their company?
If they're in the 90%.
Yeah, but that's the problem. But you can zig when you should have zagged. You run into a 10%er.
Take a year.
Yeah, but a year's a long time, though.
Yeah.
Also, people can learn like what you tolerate and don't tolerate and hide certain types of behavior from you.
Yes.
Yeah, which would be a real issue.
Oh, I've definitely experienced that, and it's and again, I think we are often. I mean, you mentioned the relationship between erotic and manipulative and crazy, or just erotic and crazy. I think there's also that when we finally receive the sorts of, I don't know, love or affection, it's not always sex, it's not always sexual, right?
Right.
Like somebody like, I don't know, like rubbing your feet or paying a little extra attention to what you say or something. For some people, that's intoxicating.
It's a lot of it is paying attention to you. A lot of it is like listening to what you have to say or asking you questions about your thoughts and your feelings, which a lot of people are unaccustomed to, and that's intoxicating to people. Because a lot of people just want to talk about themselves. So when someone wants to talk about you and really is asking questions about your feelings, that can kind of manipulate you in a weird way.
Yeah, it almost feels like a parental type of care that we're probably wired to look for. I mean, I always marvel at this and also just kind of shake my head and go, why? Why did God design us this way? But, the circuitry in our brain that creates infant-child attachment is the same circuitry that is repurposed for all other relationships in adulthood. It's not like you get your childhood attachment stuff, and then you go, okay, well, you're like 15, 16, you're moving on in the world, you're hitting puberty, you're starting to date a bit, whatever. Now let's work with a different set of mechanics, a different set of algorithms. No, it's the same set of algorithms repurposed. We know this based on the studies of infant-parent attachment, and on the basis, or infant caretaker, and on the basis of studies of romantic love. It's the same circuitry. So you're using a set of algorithms and circuitry that were designed for one thing in a very different context.
That's interesting, and it probably makes sense why a lot of men with very overbearing mothers seek overbearing wives. Yeah.
Yeah, I've learned so much recently about just how it is that we can lose our vision of other people, right? And I think this thing that we hear manipulation, it often sounds like, oh, it's really tactical, someone's rubbing their hands. I think the really tricky part about it is I do think that most people in the world are just doing their best to feel safe, to get their needs met. I think there are very few evil people.
Right.
But in this sort of pattern of repurposing childhood attachment patterns and then people bringing that forward into their adult attachment patterns, I think what ends up happening is that people, quote unquote, trying to get their needs met, oftentimes the worst ones, sometimes it's called trauma bonding, but they kind of go lock and key. Or somebody identifies somebody that's really healthy and they're like, them, I'm going to latch onto them because they're healthy, and they can, and you say, well, the healthy person should be able to spot all the landmines. But if somebody's able to really tap into like something you didn't have, or something that just feels like oxygen, right? Goodness gracious, like you could be the smartest, most well acclimated person with the best parents or whatever upbringing, which most people aren't, but some people do have that, and still fall kind of into this fog that is like, gosh, like you want to be with this person, but it doesn't feel good, that mishmash. And I think the thing I've learned clearly is that when you feel that trepidation, run, don't walk. Like it's not like the gray zone is actually the thing to just exit fast. Gray doesn't mean like hover and check it out and it's like run some experiments here.
A ticking bomb.
Get out. Yeah.
Run.
Just run.
Yeah.
Just run.
It's also, I think there's some people that are very sheltered and they've been well taken care of, and they're not accustomed to manipulative people, and they're not accustomed to dangerous people, and so they don't know. I've seen that before, both with people choosing the wrong friends and people choosing the wrong partners.
Yeah, that certainly hasn't been my pattern. Not that I had the hardest upbringing, but it was easy. I would say easier than some, harder than others. But I always had great friends, great friendships. But my threat sensing, it wasn't always great in romantic relationships, for sure. I've also had some great relationships. I think what tends to happen is that if we're very busy, we have this tendency to be easily manipulated by certain things that are unusual, that really feel like extra oxygen to us, or just feel so nourishing. And because I think people always, or often, default to sex, like it's all about sex. Depending on who you are, like sex is more or less readily available to you, right? Like I think that for some people it's nurturing, like to a certain form of nurturing. And then there's also this thing of we know how to survive certain things so they don't feel as dangerous. So people who've had like very overbearing or complicated childhoods or abusive childhoods, sometimes they're set to perceive danger at way too high a threshold. Right? So their perception of what's dangerous is like way too high, and so they walk into even still dangerous situations, but they don't think of them as dangerous. And they're like, oh, I can navigate this. They're good at navigating difficult people, or they're good at navigating, borderline people or something like that.
I think it's also exciting, which is part of the problem, is that people like excitement. And if you have a boring life and a life that doesn't have a lot of stimulation in it, and then you find someone, even if they're bad for you, but they're exciting, there's some conflict, something. There's fights and breakups and then makeups, which are exciting, and so then you get locked into this stimulation pattern, which is, or I've seen that multiple times with people. It's a real problem.
Do you think it's more of a problem with people that like excitement and adventure and are super curious, but like excitement and adventure? So I'm thinking comics. I'm thinking people who like high intensity sports, that they seek relationships that are higher intensity. Because I've received great advice from people like Rick, who said, your relationship should be a sanctuary. That should be where peace is. And actually I don't pay a lot of attention to Instagram kind of little mottos and things, but someone sent me one that I was like, yes,